Good morning. Bon dia. I will speak in English, and it's my pleasure to present Jonardon Ganeri. He will be speaking in English, as we did yesterday in the last session. He's one of our keynote speakers, and he came from Canada. Well, not exactly now. He was in Bangkok, and he did a huge travel to be here. Professor Ganeri is a distinguished professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto. His work draws on a variety of philosophical traditions to construct new positions in the philosophy of mind, metaphysics, and epistemology. He advocates an expanded role for cross-cultural methodologies in philosophical research, together with enhanced cultural diversity in the philosophical curriculum. His research interests are in consciousness, self, attention, the epistology of inquiry, the idea of philosophy as a practice and its relationship with literature. He works too on the history of ideas in early modern South Asia, intellectual affinities between India and Greece, and Buddhist philosophy of mind. Jonardon's current projects include a study of the philosophy of the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, on who he has published this book that I read and that I was fascinated by, Virtual Subjects, Fugitive Selves, Fernando Pessoa and his philosophy. And he has been working as other people I know, and as Bartolomeo Ryan, Antonio Cardiello, on Pessoa and philosophy. That was a subject that was edited and studied 50 years ago, but that we need to study and to think again, and especially if we have some notions and knowledge about not only philosophy of European philosophy, but also Buddhist philosophy, philosophy of mind, and knowledge about Asia. So, Professor Ganeri, very welcome. Thank you for being here, for accepting the invitation. And it's really my honor to be in this table with you and to share this morning in Lisbon.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for giving my talk in English. The zeitgeist during Pessoa's lifetime, writes Bartholomew Ryan in his introduction to the newly published book, Fernando, Pessoa and Philosophy, was one of great changes and disintegration, of the end of empires and the beginning of new systems in the arts, architecture, politics, philosophy, and science. From Russia to Mexico, Leon Trotsky was declaring a permanent revolution in his call for international revolutionary political upheaval. In Bern, Zurich, Prague, and Berlin, Albert Einstein was writing revolutionary papers on the equivalence of mass and energy and the theory of special relativity. Meanwhile, I'm still quoting from Bartholomew Ryan. Meanwhile, in Lisbon, Pessoa was jotting down on a loose piece of paper the idea to be plural like the universe. That's the end of the quote, being plural like the universe means for Pessoa two different things at the same time. One is to live one's life as a series of heteronyms, a sequence of virtual selves, or, to borrow Zenith's phrase, individuated points of view, each with their own style of being in the world. A style which is associated with those effective modes of poetic attention Pessoa identifies as constitutive of heteronymous identity. The other, even more radical idea, which seems in fact to predate the invention of heteronymy, consists in the thought that one might lead multiple lives in parallel, meaning specifically that one can occupy simultaneously a plurality of first-person positions. Neither idea is easy, Indeed, they teeter on the brink of intelligibility. And yet, as I want to argue in this talk, both ideas, remarkably enough, have been foreseen in the literature of classical India. And indeed, this talk is an attempt by me to bring together my interest in Pessoa with my other interest in South Asian philosophy. Pessoa had a habit of killing off his heteronyms, but might not heteronymy instead be a vehicle for a form of life extension? I have in mind a play written by Karel Čapek and first performed in 1922 called The Macropolis Case. This play has become well known to philosophers thanks to an essay by the preeminent Anglophone moral philosopher of the 20th century, Bernard Williams. For Williams, the philosophical interest of the play lies with the idea that immortality, were it even to be available, would not be desirable. Indeed, it would be decidedly tedious. The play's protagonist, Alina Macropolis, was given an elixir of life by her father, a 16th century court physician. But by the time she has reached the age of 342, she has had enough. She has been 42 for the last 300 years and is bored. A boredom, as Williams puts it, concerned with the fact that everything that could happen and make sense to one particular human being of 42 years old has already happened to her many times over. By now, she is known under the name of Emilia Marti and confesses to the fact that before this, she was Elian McGregor and Eugenia Montes and Elsa Muller and Ekaterina Mishkin. Each of these names is linked with a different period in the life of the eternal 42-year-old heroine. Are these names merely pseudonyms of the same person, or are they designations of a succession of ways of being in the world at different times, that is to say, different heteronyms? Williams writes, quote, "There are difficult questions if one presses the issue about this constancy of character. How is this accumulation of memories related to this character which she eternally has and to the character of her existence? Are they much the same kinds of events repeated? Then it is itself strange that she allows them to be repeated, accepting the same repetitions, the same limitations. Indeed, accepting is what it later becomes, when earlier it could not, or even would not have been that. The repeated patterns of personal relations, for instance, must take on a character of being inescapable. Or is the pattern of her experiences not repetitious in this way, but varied? Then the problem shifts, I'm still quoting from Williams, to the relation between these varied experiences and the fixed character. How can it remain fixed through an endless series of very different experiences? The experiences must surely happen to her without really affecting her. She must be, as EM, detached and withdrawn, end of quote. Williams argues that it's only desirable indefinitely to extend one's life if two conditions are met. The first condition is that it should clearly be, is this good? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. The first condition is that it should clearly be me who lives forever through this sequence of heteronyms. The second condition is that the state in which I survive should be one which, to me looking forward, will be adequately related in the life it presents to those aims which I now have in wanting to survive at all. He considers that the most tempting alternative to EM's life of immortal boredom is survival, this is his phrase, survival by means of an indefinite series of lives, the serial and disjoint lives alternative, as he calls it. Yet, according to Williams, all versions of this belief that one can live an indefinite series of lives, which have actually existed, have immediately failed the first condition. They get nowhere near providing any consideration to mark the difference between rebirth and new birth. Well, I want to suggest that perhaps in Pessoa's philosophy, there's a solution. But let us imagine that each of the lives in the indefinite series, which is related to the one which came before it by the relation of heteronomy. That is to say, there's a heteronymic chain, a nested series of heteronyms constituting the life of EM. If the suggestion is intelligible, then I think a life as a heteronymic chain of lives will meet both Williams' conditions. As regard the first condition, it's built into the very notion of a heteronym that my heteronym is me again. And I've shown in other writings how to make good that claim. What the second condition will now amount to is the requirement that as I anticipate life as my heteronym, that life is one which satisfies my present desire to go on living. And surely this is the case, if indeed the newness of a new way of being in the world is associated, as Pessoa claims it is, with astonishment and admiration, even for the most mundane and familiar of things. Pessoa, to recall, provides a fascinating explanation of what poetry is. He says, poetry is astonishment, admiration, as of a being fallen from the sky is taking full consciousness of his fall, astonished about things, as of one who knew things in their souls, striving to remember this knowledge, remembering it, that it was not thus he knew them, not under these forms and conditions, but remembering nothing more. Poetry is astonishment, an astonishment of the sort one feels on encountering something for the first time, a childlike wonder at what there is, and finding in everything thus encountered a deeper meaning that seems to stem from an indeterminate sense of familiarity. And poetry is admiration, a respect for the beauty of all that the world contains. Astonishment and admiration are, first of all, both world-involving states of mind. We're astonished by or at something. We feel admiration for something. They're both, moreover, affective states, emotions. One feels astonish and feels admiration. They're reactions to the world and not projections onto it, which is to say they're not primarily acts of creative imagination. And yet they're not passive reactions, as changing one's colour to fit one's environment might be considered to be. For although Pessoa's poet falls upon the world as if encountering it for the first time, he does take full consciousness of his fall. That is to say, poetic admiration and poetic astonishment are fully self-conscious emotions, emotional states of the sort that one can be in only if one is aware of oneself being in them. Poetry is a singling out of something in one's environment, the attention to it and the simultaneous attention to oneself in the act of attending to it. For Pessoa adds, quote, my inner sense predominates in such a way over my five senses that I see things in this life in a way different from other people. There is, for me, a wealth of meaning in a thing so ridiculous as a door key, a nail on a wall, or a cat's whiskers. There is, Pessoa writes, poetry in everything, in land and in sea, in lake and in riverside. It's in the city too. It's evident to me as I sit here, there's poetry in this table, in this paper, in this inkstand. There's poetry in this rattling of the cars on the streets, in each minute, common, ridiculous motion of a workman. Who on the other side of the street is painting the signboard of a butcher's shop? So the point is that anything, however mundane or seemingly insignificant, can serve as a theme of poetic astonishment and admiration. Poetic astonishment and poetic admiration are names for those states of mind whereby one not only sees things in the world as if for the first time, but also sees in those things other meanings, meanings which perhaps go unseen by those less self-aware. So EM's problem in the Macropolis case, from this perspective, is that the series of EMs is actually a series of pseudonyms and not a series of heteronyms. Her character remains constant and only her name changes. Had it been instead the case that her life was as a series of heteronyms, then her immortal boredom would never have arisen, because even if she were constantly experiencing the same things or the same sorts of things, she would endlessly experience them in ever renewed ways. So each heteronym is associated with a mode of poetic attention and therefore a distinctive mode of being astonished and admiring of the world one encounters, even if it's the same world. Now, the idea that a life might consist in a heteronymic chain of lives is remarkably foreseen in a story from a classical Sanskrit treatise, the Mokshopaya, also known as the Yoga Vasishta. It's the story of 100 Rudras. Let me retell this story. So it begins, so let me tell it. It's a little bit long, but let me read it out. Once upon a time, there was a monk who was inclined to imagine things rather a lot. He would meditate and study all the time and fast for days on end. One day this fancy came to him. Just for fun, I'll experience what happens to ordinary people. As soon as he had this idea, his thought somehow took the form of another man, and that man wished for an identity and a name, even though he was just made of thought. And by pure accident, as when a crow happens to be under a tree when a palm fruit falls from it and hits him, he thought, I'm Jivata. This dream man, Jivata, enjoyed himself for a long time in a town made in a dream. He drank too much and fell into a heavy sleep. And in his sleep, he saw a Brahmin who read all day long. One day, that Brahmin fell asleep, worn out from the day's work. But those day's activities were still alive within him, like a tree inside a seed, and he saw himself in a dream as a prince. One day that prince fell asleep after a heavy meal, and in his dream he saw himself as a king who ruled many lands and indulged in every sort of luxury. One day that king fell asleep, having gorged himself on his every desire, and in his dream he saw himself as a celestial woman. That woman fell asleep, and she saw herself as a doe with darting eyes. That doe fell asleep and dreamed that she was a clinging vine because she'd been accustomed to eating vines. For animals dream too, and they remember what they have seen and heard. The vine saw that she was a bee who used to buzz among the vines. The bee fell in love with a lotus in a pond, and one day became so intoxicated by the locust sap he drank that his wits became numb. Just then an elephant came to the pond and trampled the lotus, and the bee, still attached to the lotus, was crushed with it on the elephant's trunk. And the bee looked at the elephant. As the bee looked at the elephant, he saw himself as an elephant. That elephant fell into a deep pit and became the favorite elephant of a king. One day the elephant was cut to pieces by a sword in battle, And as he went to his final resting place, he saw a swarm of bees hovering over the sweet ochre that oozed from his temples. And so the elephant became a bee again. The bee returned to the lotus pond and was trampled under the foot of an elephant. And just then he noticed a goose beside him in the pond, and so he became a goose. That goose moved to other births for a long time, until one day he was a goose in a flock with other goose. He realized that being a goose, he was the same as the swan of Brahma, the creator. One day the swan saw the god Rudra, and he thought with sudden certainty, I am Rudra. Immediately that idea was reflected in an image in a mirror, and it took the form of Rudra. This Rudra lived in the palace of Rudra and was attended by Rudra's servants. And at the end of a round of 100 rebirths as Rudra, he thought, I am Rudra, I am he, the one who stands in the flux of rebirths where everyone is fooled by his own mind. So it's a series of nestings in which one creature falls asleep and dreams of being another creature, and so on in a kind of nested chain. Rama wonders how, if Jivata, the Brahmin, the swan, the sage, were all parts of the monk's dream, they could be real. And Vasishtha explains that it's by focusing the mind on the wish, may I be a wise person, may I be a divine, that one makes oneself 100, an idiot or a pundit, a god or a human being. The formula used to describe these various transformations, in the dream he saw himself as another, or in the dream he saw himself as being another, clearly indicates that what's in play is a phenomenon of heteronymic immersion, just as we see it illustrated in Pessoa's description of seeing himself as a fly. This is in the Book of Disquiet. Pessoa had no trouble imagining himself to be a fly. He wrote, who knows what supreme forces, gods or demons of truth, in whose shadow we roam? I may be nothing but a shiny fly that alights in front of them for a moment or two. A facile hypothesis, maybe, but I didn't think, I felt. It was carnally, directly, with a profound and dark horror, that I made this ludicrous comparison. I was a fly when I compared myself to one. I really felt like a fly when I imagined I felt like one. And I felt I had a flyish soul, slept flyishly and was flyishly withdrawn. What's more horrifying is that I felt at the same time like myself. I automatically raised my eyes to the ceiling, lest a lofty wooden ruler would swoop down and swat me as I might swat that fly. Now, the Anglophone philosopher Zeno Wendler writes in a similar vein of what he calls the performance of the intersubjective transference in imagination. In this form of transference, what I'm called upon to do, or to try to do, is to imagine the fly's pain and what it must be like, not for me, but for the fly, to be in that situation. I have to imagine being that subject to be able to imagine that pain, what it's like being on the floor, the small body. In fact, intersubjective transference in imagination is just another name for heteronomy. Now, the Vasishta story is discussed later again in the same text. Rama asking what became of the 100 Rudras. Were they all Rudras, or weren't they? How could 100 minds be made from a single mind? Vasishta is adamant that all the forms in the dream were in fact Rudra, 100-fold Rudra. Rudra's life, whatever its drawbacks, as it's described in that story, could never be said to be boring. if it were to live, if it is to live in serial the life of a king, a Brahmin, a celestial woman, a doe, a bee, an elephant, a goose, a swan, and many, many more. It is incidentally fascinating to discover in this story an echo of the famous story of the dream of the butterflies from the Zhuangzi, where Zhuangzi dreams of being a butterfly and a butterfly dreams of being Zhuangzi. In our story, Rudra dreams of being a bee, who dreams of being an elephant, who dreams of being a bee. Another Anglophone philosopher, Mark Johnson, Princeton University, has defended an interesting view about survival and personal identity, which has some points of commonality with the one currently under discussion. He argues that persons are protean, and that, I quote, as with Proteus, who could assume the forms of a lion, a leopard, a serpent, or a pig, our essence could allow changes in our form of embodiment, as long as any such change is not at odds with the person's identity-determining dispositions. Was Elena Macropolis a protean person? In a sense, yes, because her identity-determining dispositions remained the same throughout, and that indeed was the source of her tedium. The only difference is that her body did not age, and so she had no need to resort to the protean expedient recommended in Bhagavad Gita 2.22, which says, as I quote, as leaving aside worn-out garments, a man takes on other new ones, so leaving aside worn-out bodies, to other new ones goes the embodied. In other words, you remain the same person, but you go through a sequence of different embodiments. Yet Johnson's notion of an identity-determining disposition is looser than that of a fixed character. He defines it as a disposition to somehow deeply and consistently identify with some future person, a disposition one can have even if that disposition is not essentially dependent on that person's continuing to exemplify your present personality. How, though, are you meant to now to identify deeply and consistently with a future person whose personality is a mystery to you? Pessoa does indeed identify with his heteronyms, but that's because, as his creator, the personality of his heteronyms is epistemically transparent to him. Well, the philosopher of art, Richard Wollheim, famous philosopher of art, is the only philosopher I know of to discuss an idea similar to what I'm calling heteronymic chains, and the possibility of living a life consisting in one. He refers to the case where, to quote, I set myself to centrally imagine John's centrally imagining, Angus's centrally imagining, Stephen's writing his diary. That's an example of heteronymic chaining that I'm talking about. But he rejects it on the grounds that no matter how much I know about these three friends, no matter how successfully I can speculate about John's understanding of Agnes's beliefs about what Stephen thinks worth putting in his diary, I'm certain not to have this information in a form in which it would be available for me to use appropriately as the narrative unfolds. Multiply embedded repertoires, Wollheim says, are not accessible, and that's one powerful reason why such repertoires are, in effect, nominal. Putting the argument in my terminology, what Wollheim claims is that heteronymic chaining will constitute survival only if the individual at any link in the chain had access to the inner life of every subsequent link in that chain. Recall, however, William's second condition. What it states is that the state in which I survive should be one which, to me looking forward, will be adequately related in the life it presents to those aims which I now have in wanting to survive at all. It's sufficient to meet this condition that the individual can anticipate the life of their immediate successor in the heteronymic chain, i.e. to their heteronym, perhaps together with the knowledge that this is true of heteronyms in general. Heteronomy is not transitive, and survival by heteronymic chaining does not require the sort of omniscience about my future Volheim would impose upon it. One simply needs to know about the next link in the chain, and not about every subsequent link. It's true, as Derek Parfit says, that in the question of one's survival, personal identity is not what matters. What matters is relation R, which is psychological connectedness or continuity with the right kind of cause. What we have, in effect, is a new proposal as to the content of Parfit's relation R, that it's a relation of heteronomy. This will not, of course, be any sort of reductionist account of persons, because it will not be true that a complete description could be impersonal, and survival will still require bodily preservation or exchange. So I said at the beginning that the idea of being plural like the universe means two different things. One of those things I've now described is the idea of living a life conceived as a heteronymic chain of lives. That's one way of pluralizing oneself. Let me now turn to the other possible meaning. Is it even conceivable, let alone possible, that one might live multiple lives in parallel? By which I mean that one is simultaneously, rather than sequentially, an occupant of many first-person perspectives. Thanks to the presence of his female other in the forest of estrangement, in that famous story Pessoa wrote, the admiration and the astonishment of the protagonist is fused with a strange sort of love which is only partly a romantic. The protagonist says, I unsure of which one I was, or if I was both, or neither. The introduction of this female double into the story, so the Forest of Estrangement, serves two ends. One is to provide for a particular form of astonishment in this strange forest, a delight in sharing the experience without being quite certain if one is sharing it. But it's also an anticipation of a theme that would continue to occupy Pessoa as he worked on the Book of Disquiet. The theme of a single life lived in parallel. To give you some sample quotations, Pessoa writes, to dream, for example, that I'm simultaneously, severally, the man and the woman on a stroll, that a man and a woman are taking along the river. Again, he writes, it would be interesting to be two kings at the same time, not the soul of them both, but two distinct kingly souls. Again, he writes, so it's a theme that repeats many times throughout the book. He writes, the highest stage of dreaming is when, having created a picture with various figures whose lives we live all at the same time, we are jointly and interactively all those souls. This leads to an incredible degree of depersonalization and the reduction of our spirit to ashes. He writes again, as I pass by those houses, villas, and chalets, I also live the daily lives of all their inhabitants, living them all at the same time. I'm the father, mother, sons, cousins, the maid and the maid's cousins, all together and all at once, thanks to my special talent for simultaneously feeling various and sundry sensations, for simultaneously living the lives of various people, both on the outside, seeing them, and on the inside, feeling them. Notice here that Pessoa's use of the phrase on the inside, feeling them. It's more than evident that he's talking about what contemporary philosophers call de se imagining, specifically imagining being someone else. Pessoa's astounding thought experiment that one can have de se imagining of being simultaneously a plurality of other people lends to his philosophy its radically anti-Cartesian outlook. And it's evidently an idea to which Pessoa was committed from the time of his earliest writings. Now, I find again in the literature of classical India an echo of this idea. There's a retelling of the Narada story, which has Vishnu say, "I am Radha when I have the form of a woman, and I am Krishna when I have the form of a man. There is truly no difference between the two of us." Vishnu regrettably doesn't comment on the fact that it's often the case that Radha and Krishna are present both together at the same time. And yet that's just how it is for Pessoa in the Forests of Estrangement. In fact, there's the faintest of hints of exactly such a situation in the great Indian epic, the Mahabharata. Draupadi had found herself in a tight corner, having inadvertently agreed to marry all five of the Pandava brothers in a single ceremony. Her father Drupada is worried about the moral propriety of her situation. He consults the narrator Vyasa, who takes him aside and explains in secret that each of the brothers is in fact Indra. Let me read this important passage from the Mahabharata. Vyasa tells Drupada how the gods once performed a sacrifice in the Naimisha forest. Yama was busy in his sacrificial duties, with the results that creatures no longer died. The gods complained to Brahma that nothing now distinguished them from men. Brahma reassured them that once their rite was completed, men would start to die again. As the gods returned to their sacrifice, Indra saw a woman weeping into the Ganga. Each of her tears became a golden lotus. When he asked her who she was and why she was weeping, she told him to follow her, and he did so and saw a youth playing dice with some young women. The youth ignored him, and Indra began to bluster angrily. But at a glance from the youth, he found himself paralyzed. Next, the youth, who was Shiva, told the woman to bring him close that he could be divested of his pride, and at her touch he collapsed to the ground. Now he was commanded to remove the summit of the mountain and enter, and when he did so, he found 4 other Indras imprisoned there. When Indra begged for his freedom, Shiva told him that all 5 Indras would return to their own world only after being born as men. However, he agreed to their stipulation that in their human form they must not be begotten by deities, Dharma, Wind, Indra, and the Ashwins. He also promised that the goddess Shri would take a human form as their wife. Narayana agreed to this arrangement and plucked from his head 1 white and 1 black hair. These entered the wombs of Rohini and Devaki, and from them were born Balarama and Krishna. Vyasa explains to Drupada that the Pandavas are these 5 Indras, and Draupadi is Shri. Well, in this story, Vyasa doesn't quite go so far as to say that all 5 brothers are identical to Indra. He tells a story in which there are 5 Indras, alike in qualities. Indeed, it's only here, in this story whispered in secret, that we learn of the existence of 5 Indras. One might read the story simply as suggesting that the marriage is legitimate because it has a divine sanction, being a reflection on earth of an arrangement that the gods themselves find acceptable. But I think that the fact that all the 5 Indras are called Indra, together with the fact that this is the only reference in the epic to there being more than one Indra, supports a different interpretation, namely that all 5 Pandava brothers are heteronyms of Indra, living lives in parallel. They will live together simultaneously. Indra promises to use his strength to make a man, the 5th of the brothers. And this recalls the second phase of the process of becoming an avatara, the phase involving self-creation or manifestation. Draupadi has in effect simply married the same man 5 times over and not 5 different men. There is here too a forest to which Draupadi is banished along with her 5 husbands, a forest of estrangement in more senses than one. And in the forests of estrangement, Pessoa is both the man and the woman. She's not him and he's not her. Their relation is one of heteronymic community. Pessoa writes, "We are obscurely two, neither of us knowing for sure if we are actually the other, if the uncertain other lived." Richard Zenith makes an important comment on this passage, writing that 2 selves in one, male and female, Pessoa's narrative sums up the languorous non-drama of self-othered existence. I'm coming to the end now, but let me just note that one more refraction of the idea of a life lived in parallel can be retrieved from what we know of the Mesoamerican philosophy of the Maya. Alexis MacLeod has explicated the Maya concept of kex, or substitution, in terms of a notion of embedded identity. He writes that Janab Pakal, in his tomb in Palenque, is depicted in the temple of the inscriptions at the side of the maize god, signifying rebirth, and is adorned with the chak shib chak ornament. I apologize for my pronunciation. Pectoral adornment in Maya imagery generally represents the essence of the person depicted, and this act is often called substitution, kex. Substitution was thought of as a method of one entity's taking on the essence of another, and in this becoming the being represented. One did not, however, lose one's individual identity in taking on or becoming part of the substituted entity. This is the sense in which we might call the identity of one being a substitute, with a substitute, an embedded identity. A ruler such as Janab Pakal of Palenque can become or represent Chak Shib Chak through substitution, while still remaining Janab Palak. At the time of substitution, Janab Palak is Janab Palak and Chak Shib Chak at the same time. End of quote. That's MacLeod's summary of this Maya concept of substitution. MacLeod notes that the question then becomes, how do we think of entities or persons such as Chak Shib Chak? One way of thinking of them is as collective persons, a single person made of a collectivity of essences, perhaps related to the Palenque rulership lineage. Further features of kex or substitution can help us here to understand how the individual and collective essences are related. Robert Colston observes in a similar vein that this concept of kex or substitution relates to what might be best be described as a form of reincarnation, an integral aspect of Maya religion. Chex is a way of making the new out of the old. At the same time, just as a single plant produces multiple offspring, Chex is a change from one into many. Together, Jal and Chek form a concentric system of change within change, a single system of transformation and renewal. Well, all this, and I'm concluding now, very closely mirrors the secret story of the genesis of the 5 Pandava brothers, revealed to Draupadi on her wedding night so as to reconcile her father's conscience with her polyandry. Indra has become, through substitution, each one of the 5 brothers. MacLeod introduces the helpful notion of an embedded identity to grasp the sense in which Janab Palak is Janab Palak and is also Chak Shib Chak. The identity of Chak Shib Chak is embedded within that of Janab Palak and not a replacement of it. I think that heteronomy is just the concept we need here to make sense of this notion of embedded identity within the frame that's constituted by the concentric system of change. Chak Shib Chak is Janab Pakal and is also all of the other rulers of the Palenque lineage. It would be inaccurate to say that Janab Pakal literally becomes Chak Shib Chak. Rather, it's within a heteronymous frame of ritual and representation that the identity holds good. Just as it makes sense for Pessoa to say, in my dream, I was another. So with that, I'll conclude my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ganeri. So if there are any remarks, questions, comments, reactions. Please, Bartolomeo, Ryan. We have a microphone. Just 1 second. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonardon. That was it's fascinating. And I recommend Jonardon's book, Virtual Subjects and Fugitive Selves, which I think for many of us was, it opened up a way of looking at Pessoa. And I think you're really going down the right track by looking at classical Indian thought and Asian thought. It's really shedding a lot of light on Pessoa and actually the depth of Pessoa, philosophically speaking. I'm thinking aloud here, but when I was listening to you, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and especially the kind of the profound, almost anti-Cartesian direction that Pessoa goes in. And my question maybe is just when you were speaking there, some of your comments about especially the heteronomic, or the immersive heteronomy. Could we think almost, because Pessoa is interesting when you mentioned astonishment, that it's not quite reaction, it's not quite action. There's something, and that's all the way through the book of Disquiet, that he's against action, but yet the whole time he's acting and he's working very hard. As you give this great example of the fly, which is just extraordinary, and that's he's very much being proactive there and acting. So I'm just wondering, could we think of Pessoa almost, he's a philosopher acting as a poet? Well, his poets like Alvaro Campos or Alberto Cairo, they're poets who are acting like philosophers. They're because of especially Campos and even when Pessoa is writing as a poet, you have all these modern philosophical elements like doubt, the uncertainty principle, anxiety, tedio, and yet Pessoa kind of as the one that's creating these plurality of the universe, and you say it beautifully with the 2 elements in the being plural like the universe. Pessoa himself is the philosopher. So I guess my final point then will be to say that, is he doing something with epistemology that we need to feel philosophy in order to get to the heteronomy, and almost we need to think poetry in a weird way. He's doing this kind of crossover, because when he talks about poetry being astonishment, that's the ancient philosophy element. That's the ancient perspective of philosophy. Philosophy is astonishment. Um, Philosophy is wonder. And of course, no longer modern philosophy is not wonder. Modern philosophy is doubt and verification and negativity. But Pessoa, so I don't know if you're getting me. So this kind of crossover, feeling philosophy and thinking poetry, is a way into something something original, or something, an opening for Pessoa. That was my kind of question for you. Thank you very much, though. It's very stimulating and very inspiring.
Back.
Should I put my question? Thanks very much. Lots of things. Let me just focus on something very small, trying to tease out perhaps some of the elements in your talk that I wish that you could have said more about. I think that, yes, I agree with Bartholomew that your attempt to link Pessoa with classical Indian thought can bring in many new insights. But it seemed to me in the examples that you were giving that we were talking all the time about sequential transference of identity rather than simultaneous, except perhaps for the last one with Indra. I don't know the example, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to me that it's your interpretation that we could see something like simultaneity there, but in your very brief aperçu, I still couldn't see it. So the question about what would be, I think, a significant difference, simultaneity versus sequentiality, is one I would like to hear more. And together with that is the fact that I think you didn't touch on the difficult issue of hierarchy, because the heteronyms are not all the same in terms of value. Whereas the different identities that you were presenting to us, I couldn't distinguish, again, except possibly with Nindra, if we think that it is the father that projects himself into the five brothers, and perhaps there is something there. But obviously, Pessoa goes the extra step of making Cairo, as we know, the master of them all, including of the Pessoa ortonym. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, let me respond quickly. I know that we're running out of time. Yes, thanks, Bartholomew. You, in your introduction, to your book, you raised this question: is Pessoa a philosophical poet or a poetic philosopher? And yeah, I was thinking about that question quite a lot, and I thought that perhaps what I was trying to, the direction I was thinking perhaps of going in was to say that what makes a heteronym a particular way of experiencing the world is precisely that each heteronym, or each subject, each self, experiences the world with a particular type of poetic attention. There's a way of attending to the world poetically. It's a very good book, actually, by Lucy Alford, that's came out recently, called Modes of Poetic Attention. And this idea that poetry is a unique way of attending to the world, and that one can take these unique ways, poetic ways of attending, as being constitutive of being a subject. You know, being a subject is a way of being in the world, and perhaps that's a way of tending to the world in a poetic fashion. So each of the heteronyms could be a distinct mode of attending poetically to the world. And that's that makes the heteronyms both philosophical and poetic at the same time. So I thought that might be a way to solve this conundrum about whether Pessoa is a philosophical poet or a poetic philosopher. Paolo, you're right that most of the talk was devoted to the idea that a life could constituted by a heteronymic chain a sequential heteronymic chain of heteronyms. And I didn't say much about the idea, which clearly is very important to Pessoa, as I tried to demonstrate by giving so many quotations. I mean, it's an idea that he constantly comes back to. In fact, even in his pre-heteronymic writings, he already toys with this idea that one can be many subjects simultaneously. It's a really tricky idea to get one's head around. And all I did in this talk was to give two brief indications of where you might find that idea. The Indra example, we have a moral puzzle, which is that Draupadi has married 5 brothers all at once, and this presents something of a moral quandary. And the solution seemed to consist in the suggestion that they are all the same person, although that would then be what would then be the case is that she had married 5 heteronyms of the same person. So, but I did look at the text quite carefully to find. You're quite right to say that the idea is not explicitly formulated there, and I went and checked the Sanskrit text and the Mahabharata, and it's not really clearly formulated. So it's only a kind of half a suggestion. And then again, this my idea of substitution seems to, the scholars who write about it seem to be hinting about this idea that the lineage of kings are all one and the same person. But that again could look like a sequential rather than a parallel concept, unless you think that they are all simultaneously alive at the same time. So yeah, I mean, you're right. In my book, I query whether the concept of occupying simultaneously a multiplicity of first-person positions can be made philosophically coherent. It's a really tricky notion to. It's a really tricky notion to make philosophically coherent. And I drew on some of the intersectionist writings from Pessoa to try to do that, but it's very tricky. Yeah.
Thank you. We have some time pressure, so we will have to move on to the next session and table. But thanks again, and let's continue the conversation in a moment and outside. And we don't have today, I think, time for coffee breaks, so or 5 minutes. It's what Rui is telling me. Thanks again.